I kept the mug of coffee close to my lips as if it were a lantern I could drink. Steam rose against the window and blurred the view of the city 24 stories below, headlights drifting like small constellations on wet asphalt. Our office turned brittle in bad weather. The glass conference rooms went cold, the printers coughed, the elevators forgot their manners. The building didn't have a heartbeat so much as a stubborn pulse, the hum of servers, and the whisper of shoes across polished floors, people performing competence for one another. I had learned to do the performance too, sleeves rolled, hair back, a necklace I never took off, the soft leather notebook I carried like a second spine. It had been a year since my divorce finalized on a Tuesday afternoon, while a courier waited outside the courthouse with a falafel wrap. By the time I made it back to the office, rain had pooled in the seat of my bicycle. I still remember the sound my chair made when I sat, the damp fabric confessing my day to the empty room. After that, I taught myself to move like water around any sudden change. I arrived earlier. I left later. I drank my coffee slowly and walked everywhere on the far side of noise. That morning, the rain made a sheet of the city. The skyline looked like a series of thoughtful cuts. I watched the reflection of my own face in the glass for longer than I meant to, then turned when the elevator chimed, drawing the whole floor's attention as if it were a dinner bell. Our new chief strategy officer stepped out with a tidy economy of movement, the kind that suggested private practice, both legal and athletic. He took the place in, not in one sweep, but with the patience of someone who trusts first impressions less than second ones. He wore a slate suit, a cautious tie, and some faint citrus that drifted after him like a well-kept secret. He introduced himself to the executive team with that composed warmth men cultivate after years of small rooms and big decisions. By mid-morning, he found me in the corner office that wasn't mine, but had been assigned to me for the week. A glass cube with a view of a billboard and a sliver of river beyond. He said my name like an entry in a ledger, Ms. Clarke. His voice had edges to it I didn't expect, grain, sincerity, something weathered but intact. He said he'd read my analysis on the internal efficiencies project, and that he found it both thorough and unafraid of difficult numbers. Then he said we would be working closely, at least for a quarter. It was a decent first encounter, built on mutual utility. When he said my name again, Ms. Clarke, the words felt cool and respectful, like the start of a formal dance. I nodded, also formal. Names are boundary lines at work. The less familiar we are with how people hold themselves, the more careful we are with the labels we apply. He asked if I could join a meeting at noon. He said it plainly, without coaxing or theatrical urgency. As if he understood that my time, like his, was already scheduled twice over. By noon the rain had braided itself into a steadier fall. The meeting was inside Conference B, a glass aquarium with a whiteboard that still held ghosts of previous worries. Arrows, percentages, the brave optimism of a circle around a date. He ran the meeting with economy. When someone drifted off topic, he brought them back without force, like steering a canoe with a slight shift of the shoulders. Every few minutes his gaze returned to me, not for approval but for calibration, and I found myself straightening in my chair as if an invisible seam joined the two of us across the table. When he referred to me, he said Ms. Clarke, and I liked the measure of distance in it. It implied trust that could be earned rather than assumed. My work had its own weather system those days. I was responsible for smoothing the frictions in a company that had grown faster than its muscles. We were a financial technology firm that liked to call ourselves a platform, as if the word could suspend us above the mess. Departments that used to wave at each other now needed translators. Sales loved promises. Product loved patience. Operations loved the quiet middle where neither promise nor patience showed up on any chart. My job was to listen for the squeaks and groans in the machinery and make a plan for oil. After that first meeting, he sent me an email with a stripped subject line, "Good work." He used complete sentences like a person who means them. 2 days later, he appeared at the doorway of my temporary glass box holding a stack of printing, his expression thoughtful. He said he'd reviewed my risk memo and wanted to discuss assumptions before the board presentation. His tone was simple, but the air changed a fraction. I could feel my pulse respond the way it did before a run. A subtle tightening, anticipating ground. We walked through my numbers slowly. He had a way of asking questions that made me feel both seen and unexposed. He would point to a line and say he wondered what would happen if we shifted our view from quarterly to seasonal, not because he doubted my approach, but because he suspected it could carry more weight than we were allowing. When he'd agreed, it was quiet. When he disagreed, it was the same quiet, but the floor seemed to tilt a degree, and I'd catch my breath as if I'd stepped onto a moving train. Office gossip moved like condensation across glass, not a storm, but an accumulative damp. People noticed our collaboration, as they notice any two people who pass ideas back and forth with a kind of private current. I'd hear my name in the kitchen pause just slightly when I walked in. Someone said he'd never stayed this late his first week anywhere else. Someone else said he had recently canceled a vacation in order to handle a crisis at his former firm, which made him both admirable and unavailable. I said little. I had learned, after a marriage that exhausted itself on words, to value silence as a way not of withholding, but of respecting what was not yet ready to be named. Over the next weeks, we settled into a rhythm. Morning coffee, reports, small nods in hallways. Afternoon edits, a quick exchange of emails with precise subject lines like T+1 and pipeline, variants of the language we both spoke fluently. We had conversations during which we never said each other's first names. It wasn't chilly, just professional. The edges touched and then released. Still, there were moments that tugged at the fabric. He would glance at my notebook and ask if I always used the same pen. A question so small, it was almost a kindness and therefore dangerous. I would notice that when he removed his jacket to write at the whiteboard, his sleeves were folded with a uniform neatness that suggested ritual. Something in me recognized the comfort of ritual. It says, "I will not be surprised into recklessness." The project became a living thing. A competitor underbid us on a contract that mattered more for optics than revenue. A rumor began that our platform wasn't stable enough to handle a major client's growth. A small leak appeared in our own systems, then sealed itself before anyone but a sleepless analyst, and I saw it. We baked all of it into our strategy. Fix the leak, over-communicate to the client, invite the competitor's salesperson to a panel, and flatter him into admitting his price was a loss leader, not a sustainable model. Business is choreography. Most of us just pretend to discover the steps as we go, but those who look like they're gliding have practiced in empty rooms. We practiced a lot in empty rooms. One evening in particular, the office had that after-hours ache. Lights dimmed except for islands around computers, the rain turning from sheets to threads. He asked whether I had time to run through the board deck one more time. I did. We stepped into Conference D, the one that caught the city lights at an angle, and he closed the door with that unfussy deliberation I had come to trust. I spoke through the narrative we built, how we would admit the company's growing pains, present the fixes, claim the pain as proof we were alive and ambitious. He watched and occasionally tilted his head, not in skepticism but in attention. When I finished, He said that if I believed the story, I should tell it as if I had written it on a train between cities with a stranger's shoulder touching mine. Aware of proximity, aware of speed, aware of the slight sway that means you are moving forward whether you intend to or not. I smiled without letting it become anything much. I said that was a vivid image. He said he liked trains. I said I preferred them to planes. He said the same. Proximity, speed, the slight sway. A silence pooled between us that wasn't empty, only unspent. The glass reflected us like co-conspirators. He cleared his throat, then shifted the conversation back to slide 8, the line chart that made truth look like a mountain. The next morning I stood by the window again, this time with a jasmine tea someone had left by the sink and I had adopted. The city smelled rinsed. People walked a fraction taller, coats unbuttoned, as if they had survived something together. He arrived earlier than usual, and I realized I had started to watch for the moment when his reflection would appear behind mine in the glass, the way a melody returns in a song. He asked if I had a moment to discuss a different matter. His voice was quiet, and I understood that the matter would not immediately show up on any spreadsheet. We walked down a hallway toward a smaller conference room the interns sometimes used for studying, and I noticed that his tie had a pattern of tiny navy squares, as regular as steps taken by someone who has taught himself to dance after years of believing he could not. He explained that a document had circulated off-cycle, an internal projection meant for the board, but still in editing. Someone had forwarded a draft to a department lead. Now a rumor had grown teeth. Whispers that we planned to cut a division we were, in fact, preparing to support with new hires. People were frightened. People were angry. Panic is a kind of glue. It collects whatever is near. He asked if I had sent the draft. I said no. I said he could search my inbox if the question needed a tangible answer rather than a trusted one. He said he didn't doubt me. He said my work was precise, and that precision usually travels with discretion. Then he asked if I could help him find where the leak had started. Not the first time I had traced the path of a secret through the office, but the first time the request felt like a hand placed at the small of my back in a crowded room. We found it within a day. An analyst in FP&A had forwarded the draft to a friend in operations, who had kept it in a personal folder for reference, and then, when the friend arrived late, had summarized it out of context. She had not meant harm, she had meant to sound informed. I suggested we gather both and explain the consequences without humiliation. He agreed, and I watched him in that meeting move with the authority of someone who knows the difference between correcting and breaking. He said the company survives on trust, and trust is a collection of small deeds. He did not raise his voice. The analyst cried quietly into a tissue, and the friend apologized with the fierce sincerity of someone raised to be good. I felt something loosen in my chest that I had been holding since the divorce, the certainty that people made of their worst acts the sum of themselves. He believed, I realized, in repair. Not everyone does. If I say we became closer, I must use the precise ruler for that word. What changed was the texture of our silences. They stopped being buffers and became spaces we shared, the way two people reading different books can share a couch in a room with rain and feel, separately and together, at peace. We began to have late-night check-ins that were less about the project and more about the weather of the day. Who looked overtired, which department needed a visit, what we owed one another by virtue of the positions we held. He told me, one evening, that he had once thought success meant never needing anything from anyone. Age, he said, had taught him that success meant knowing whom you could need without shame. He said it quietly, his gaze somewhere beyond the glass, the city holding its breath. I thought of how my marriage had failed in part because neither of us could admit the simplest needs without turning them into evidence against ourselves. Office gossip thickened with the rumor of a different kind of leak, the human kind. A joke about the two of us appeared in the group chat the younger associates used, and although neither of us was in it, the joke found us anyway, parceled out by a well-meaning colleague who said transparency keeps things healthy. HR called me in for a routine check, which was not routine, and asked whether I felt comfortable working closely with the CSO. I said yes. I said he behaved with absolute professionalism. They nodded in the tone of people adding up figures they do not entirely trust. On the Thursday before the board presentation, the elevator stopped between floors for 13 minutes. It was the kind of glitch the building practiced on cold days, and the air inside the steel box smelled faintly of aftershave and hot machinery. A young man from legal swore under his breath, and then apologized to no one in particular. A woman from marketing scrolled through her phone and darted her eyes upward as if she could lift us by wish. He stood at my side with his hands in his pockets, the tie with navy squares subdued under the dim light, and asked me softly if I was all right. I nodded. I have always preferred elevators to stairs. I like trusting a machine to make the decisions for me. When the box jerked and then stilled, he shifted a fraction closer. The distance between our shoulders felt like a decision we made together and pretended was architectural. That night, we stayed to rehearse one last time. The city's lights arranged themselves like an argument you could win if you just kept talking. Jazz bullied from someone's desk speaker down the hall, a saxophone negotiating with rain. I made notes with my reliable pen and circled a phrase on slide 8 because he had said it in a way I wanted to remember. When I handed him the printed set, our fingers brushed, nothing more than a meeting of temperature, and yet my breath narrowed as if I'd stepped from shadow into sun. He said I had been steady through a turbulent month. He said he appreciated my judgment. I said I appreciated working with a leader who noticed when people were carrying more than their share. He asked how I was, not the work me but the person. The question startled me because we were, by then, proficient at discussing everything except the living parts of ourselves that did not have a place on any slide. I said I was learning to be alone without being lonely. I said it like an item on a checklist, but my voice scraped. He listened as if I'd handed him something breakable. He said that after his marriage ended, he started running at night not for fitness but to outrun the noise. He described the way the city looks from the river path at 11, the bridges and the lights and the small animals that dart across your peripheral vision and remind you you are not the only creature awake. He ran until need turned into habit and habit into calm. He said that sometimes, even now, when the day has held too much, he stands by the window of his apartment and watches the other windows, everyone living their lives with the curtains half open like souls not yet fully dressed. We were both quiet then. The office held the sound of an HVAC system doing its best. Rain traced soft fingers down the glass. He set the deck aside and said my work had become something he relied on. He said it in a way that did not burden me but honored me. I did not know what to do with the warmth that rose in me like a tide, so I did what I do best. I brought us back to the task. We reviewed the risk slide. We adjusted the footnote. We promised to arrive early. We stood to leave. In the hallway, the lights lowered another notch, the building performing its nightly imitation of dusk. He walked with me toward the elevators, our steps almost synchronized. At the bank of buttons, we paused. He looked as if he might say something and then waited, which has always been the most intimate form of speech. When the elevator arrived, its interior bright as a confession, We stepped in and watched the doors close like a pair of lips unable to decide whether to speak or kiss. He pressed the button for the lobby. I watched the numbers descend, and then he said my name, my first name, almost too softly to hear. Not Ms. Clarke. Not the ledger entry, not the dance at a distance. My name as if it were a secret he had carried for weeks in the lining of his jacket, and only now discovered a quiet corner in which to take it out and show me it had remained warm. There was no flourish to it, no borrowed romance. Just the sound of me, precise and careful on his tongue. I did not turn to him because turning would have been a beginning we could not end. I let the name slip through me and unlock something that had been waiting like a bird restless in a cage. I said his name too, not in answer, but in acceptance. We stood without touching. We descended into a lobby that smelled of stone and rain. I was aware of my breath in a way that made everything else seem less urgent. The board presentation the next morning was clean. PowerPoint can profile truth into rectangles, but sometimes those rectangles are the shape a complex reality needs in order to be understood. I told our story the way a person tells how she made it through a storm with a coat that was not waterproof, honest about the damp, proud of the fact she kept walking. He spoke with that calm authority of his, and did not try to impress so much as to persuade, and in the end, even the board member whose face always wore the sullen expression of a moral frown nodded. We left without the sour taste of compromise. We left with the possibility of sleep. Sleep did not come easily. The human rumor mill had not exhausted itself in our absence, and by afternoon HR summoned me again. This time the conversation had a page of printed bullet points and a glass of water set at an angle meant to be comforting. I was asked whether lines had blurred. I was asked whether I felt pressured. I was asked whether he and I had discussed topics unrelated to work outside of office hours. I answered truthfully. Lines had not blurred, we had drawn them ourselves with deliberate pens. I did not feel pressured. I felt respected. We had spoken of running, of rivers, of windows. The HR manager nodded, and her eyes softened at the mention of rivers, as if she too had walked along one at night and listened to her own footsteps to hear whether she still belonged to herself. She said thank you and let me go. I left with a pulse in my throat that did not quiet until I reached the stairwell and stood for a minute alone, hands flat against cool railing, counting my breaths as if they were stitches. Corporate life teaches you to pretend that the room's temperature never changes, but the rest of that week, I could feel a drift of warmth wherever we were near. We met with legal. We refined a training. The analyst who had forwarded the draft asked for a mentor and ended up with one. He and I spoke once, after everyone else had gone, about the interplay of responsibility and desire, but only as a matter of professional ethics. He said he would not endanger a career he respected. I said I would not risk my own to satisfy a hunger that might only be the echo of other hungers. We stood very still after that, as if we were balancing on a narrow beam and wanted to prove we could hold ourselves upright without reaching for one another. When we left, our shadows touched first. The night it turned was not a turning so much as a deepening. Rain again, because rain has a way of cleaning the city and complicating it at once. The streets shone. Jazz again, somewhere distant, carrying the memory of the note in his voice when he had said my name in the elevator. I stayed later than I needed to, not out of avoidance this time but out of a desire to finish what the day had started. He sent a message that he would be in the small conference room near the elevators if I wanted to weigh in on a detail of the rollout plan. The message had no subtext. It did not need any, because the subtext had been the air around us for weeks. I found him with his jacket off and a loosened tie, sleeves at his forearms, the whiteboard divided into two sensible columns. He looked steady and tired, as if he had carried a weight he trusted himself to bear. We reviewed the plan and improved it by a fraction only we would notice. Then we stood there with the city pressed against the glass like an audience. I felt the slight tremor in the air that happens when two people have kept their balance for too long and understand the cost of never shifting their feet. He said my name again, not the cool respect of Ms. Clarke, and not the whispered elevator experiment. My name like a secret he was willing to protect even while speaking it. He said that his integrity mattered to him more than his comfort, but that integrity included acknowledging when something real was asking to be cared for. He said that the safest path was to continue as we were, to shepherd the company through the next quarter with our carefully parsed emails and the discipline of deliberate distance. He also said that safe was not always the same as right. I told him I had become adept at safe, that after my marriage I had built a life like a clean, well-lit room where every object had a purpose and nothing had sharp corners. I said that sometimes at night I missed sharp corners. He closed his eyes for a second, as if he were listening to a piece of music that might hurt him. When he opened them, there was not resolve so much as recognition. We did not move fast. He took one step toward me, and I matched it as if we were in a mirror. He lifted his hand but did not touch me. I watched his fingers, ordinary, capable, hover in the space where permission is granted or refused. My body's answer was a small forward sway I could theoretically attribute to the building's own tremor. I said his name again and tasted the promise in it. If I describe the moment that followed, I must obey the boundary I set for myself when the divorce taught me what not to expose. We stood close enough to feel each other's breath. There was a touch to my forearm like a question, a pause, a second touch to the line of my jaw, as if he were rearranging the world to include me. I felt the caution he always wore begin to soften, not unravel. The city and the rain and the late hour bent around us, as if the building itself were willing to pretend it had not seen. The night faded around us, leaving only breath and promise. After we did not declare anything, no plan, no timetable, no confession beyond what we had already admitted by standing still. We sat at the small table and talked quietly about the week ahead. We spoke as if we had already learned how to carry this with dignity. He said he would speak to HR about recusing himself from decisions that affected my compensation or advancement. He said we all choose the shape of our vulnerability, and this was the shape he could live with. I said that if the company forced a choice, I would choose sunlight over secrecy every time. I had hidden too much of myself for too long in a marriage that subsisted on half-truths, and I would not do it again. He agreed. We decided our truth would not be a rumor carried by others. When it needed to be shared, we would share it ourselves. The rumor, of course, found its way. That is the nature of shared spaces, air moves. A week later, an executive who liked to perform moral authority pulled him aside and made an insinuation that insulted both of us by being lazy. He walked away from that conversation and came straight to my desk. He asked if I had a moment, and I said yes, my voice steady and this time unafraid. We went to a small room with a window over the river and called the HR manager together. He said, plainly, that we were building something outside of work hours that we believed we could carry without compromising our work. He said he would formally recuse himself from any process touching my role. He said he was proud of my contribution to the company and would remain proud regardless of whether anyone thought that pride had a private root. I felt heat climb my throat and held my shoulders back. The HR manager listened, asked practical questions, then thanked us for being direct. policies exist for precisely this knife edge. We stepped out into the hall feeling not undone but aligned, as if the floor we walked had risen to meet our feet. It was not simple. No real thing is. There were days we hardly spoke beyond the words needed to move the work. There were mornings when we happened to arrive at the same time and shared an elevator and did not risk more than a small smile. There were evenings when we stayed late, and someone would pass our conference room and see us at opposite ends of the table and draw their own conclusion, which might have been right and might have been wrong. The project matured, stabilized, began to demonstrate its own worth. We handed responsibilities down to people we had trained well. We started leaving a little earlier. 2 months later, in late spring, the river looked less like a wound and more like a line someone had drawn with intention. The chill left the building's bones. I moved my things from the temporary glass office into one with a smaller view and less draft. I bought a plant that refused to die. He started taking Fridays off 1 hour early to meet his brother's daughter at a playground and convince her that long division would not break her. I ran on weekends, sometimes along the water. He described and learned the rhythm of my breath without the urgency of escape. We were careful in public, easy in private, and honest with the people who needed honesty to do their jobs. When we did not see each other for a day, I carried in my pocket the knowledge that this was not absence but space, the way a pause in music is not silence, but the note waiting to be struck. Our first names became normal between us, no longer instruments of risk. Sometimes he would still say Ms. Clarke in a meeting, deferential and amused. A small theater we played for others, because ritual contains chaos. On a warm evening at the end of the quarter, the office lights dimmed one by one as if the building had decided to exhale. We stood at the window and watched the city perform its usual tender show. Streets soft with motion, a siren borrowing drama from the night, a couple hurrying under one umbrella toward a door that would open eagerly. We talked about the project and the next one, and about how trust accumulates like interest if you keep making deposits. He touched my shoulder, light as a comma. I turned to him and felt, again, the peace that comes when something has chosen you as much as you have chosen it. Months later, we would tell a story about how grown people navigated a choice without abandoning themselves at either end of it. We would laugh about the jasmine tea I kept stealing and the precise squares on his favorite tie. We would marvel that restraint, when chosen rather than imposed, was not a denial but a form of attention, a way of saying we would not hurry through the parts that made everything else worth it. We would not claim a victory. We would claim a life. On a late Friday, when the rain had returned not as a storm, but as a memory of one, I left the building with my umbrella closed and my hair damp, enjoying the small luxury of not protecting myself from everything. He walked beside me to the corner. We did not touch. We did not need to. He said my name the way he had that night, like a secret, but one the world no longer needed to hide. I said his name back, and we parted, each toward a separate door that opened with the same key. Warmth that did not ask to be performed, respect that did not need to be announced, a closeness that was neither chance nor accident, but choice.